Resistance is growing inside Russia against the war in Ukraine. Hundreds of people have been arrested now in protests against the new military draft, and thousands of others are actually fleeing the country. The U.S. is warning of catastrophic consequences for Russia if they use nukes in this conflict. And our foreign correspondent Tom Soufi Burridge is there with the latest from Ukraine.
A sense of crisis brewing for the Kremlin, anger spilling over towards Russia's new military draft, with Putin's war in Ukraine failing. Protesters facing down the police in the Russian Republic of Dagestan. Police officers firing warning shots in the air, attempting to disperse an angry crowd. Women outraged their men are being drafted, questioning the police what the war is for. The chaos in Dagestan clear in these videos circulating online. And in St. Petersburg, officers seen kicking a protester in the head. Human rights activists saying more than 2,300 people have been arrested in 35 cities across Russia in recent days. Long lines at Russia's border with Georgia as huge numbers of Russian men flee the country to avoid the draft. And with Putin increasingly in a corner, the US vowing to respond if Russia uses nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
We have communicated directly, privately, to the Russians at very high levels that there will be catastrophic consequences for Russia if they use nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
Meanwhile, Russia preparing to annex parts of Ukraine which are occupied by its troops, staging referendum votes there. But Ukrainians who fled those regions protesting in Kiev, calling the referendums a sham. Yana Kushova from Mariupol, a city destroyed and occupied by the Russians. We are Ukrainians, she says, and we want to live on our Ukrainian land in our hometown.
Tom joining me now live from Kyiv. So, Tom, just put this in perspective for us about how serious this resistance is right now against the war in Ukraine.
I think it's a major challenge for the Kremlin, Kira. I mean, it's the combination, isn't it? It's the defeats that Russia has suffered on the battlefield here, then Putin responding with this military draft, and then the ensuing protests. Now, over the weekend, we've seen pretty sizable protests in Russian cities, given the potential penalties for protesters, but, you know, still quite small protests, and the authorities able to crack down in true fashion on those protests. Now, what we're seeing in Dagestan, this region in the Caucasus, which has had a checkered history in terms of its relationship with Moscow, you know, that region had a violent insurgency for several years against Moscow rule. But we're seeing there a much more violent picture. We're seeing many more attacks on recruitment offices. We're seeing those scenes we just saw in my report there of really protesters facing down the police. And that is a particular challenge for the Kremlin. Now, that could spread. It's not typical of the protests everywhere else in Russia. And then we get on to the other problem that the Kremlin is facing, and that is the mass exodus. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Russian men rushing out of Russia via various countries to get away from the draft. And that, again, is undermining the draft itself and undermining Putin's war here in Ukraine.
So what is Russia doing to stop all those men from fleeing?
Well, the reports at the borders are quite conflicting. There are conflicting reports about whether or not Russia is going to close its borders. At the moment, it appears that men are getting out to countries like Georgia, Kazakhstan, some into Finland. I mean, you have to remember that for getting into Finland and basically towards Western Europe, that's much harder for Russians to do, given visa restrictions, which have been tightened in recent weeks and months because of the war here in Ukraine. So it's not an easy path out. We're seeing huge queues at the border, particularly the Georgian border, out of Russia into that country south of Russia. But a lot of people are leaving.
So what more is Ukraine going to do to respond just to this rising resistance and the potential, you know, for anti-war demonstrators to be sent to the front lines?
Well, I mean, there are reports of the Russians trying to actually forcibly conscript people in occupied parts of Ukraine. That's quite an interesting dynamic. But I think the language coming out of Kyiv on this is interesting. It speaks of the confidence of the Ukrainian authorities right now, given their successes on the battlefield, particularly up in the northeast, where we've just come back from, in the Kharkiv region, where they pushed the Russian forces out of thousands of square miles of territory. And President Zelensky over the last couple of nights has been making direct appeals in Russian to new Russian conscripts, saying, if you surrender, we will treat you humanely. And if you don't want to go back to Russia and then face criminal penalties for defecting, we will not deport you forcibly either. So they're really trying, I think, the Ukrainian authorities to make the most of this. They know that the dynamic in Russia as it plays out could act in their favor in terms of the war here.
So Russia has begun holding, these sham referendums in the areas it occupies in Ukraine, joining Russia in this effort to legitimize its annexation in the coming days. So what is the main concern, Tom, with these sham referendum votes in Russian-occupied territory?
Well, look, there's no doubt about it, Kira. The end game of the Russian authorities is to simply declare that those occupied territories are part of Russia. And the danger is that the rhetoric, and we've seen it in recent days, from high-ranking Russian officials, including Vladimir Putin last week himself, saying that really once they annex those territories, they will consider attacks on those territories as attacks on Russia. And the Russian foreign minister over the weekend implying that would include the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. Now, we've seen clear warnings from the White House over the weekend and revealing that they are privately coming up with incredibly firm warnings to the Kremlin that the US would respond and respond decisively, in the words of the White House. But, make no mistakes, this process that we're seeing in occupied parts of Ukraine by the Russian authorities is not a free and fair election. We're seeing quite bizarre scenes of Russian soldiers escorting election officials to people's houses to vote. And really, the result of those so-called referendums is a foregone conclusion. We expect them to finish tomorrow, and then we think that Russia might declare those regions, Ukrainian regions, to be part of Russia on Thursday or Friday of this week.
All right, Tom Soufi Burridge will be talking a lot as this continues, of course. Tom, appreciate it. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.